Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you for joining us this Tuesday night. We now have just 43 days left in the Trump presidency, but he's still fighting the inevitable.
Well, we're going to have to see who the next administration is because we won in the swing states and there was terrible things that went on.
Let's just get this out of the way. He lost the swing states. He lost the popular vote by more than 7 million. He lost the Electoral College, and he lost it by a lot. Plus, his crack legal team is getting laughed out of every single court that it presents cases to. It's losing case after case, state after state. The latest loss, U.S. Supreme Court late this afternoon rejecting a bid by a Pennsylvania congressman to decertify the results in his state. Trump is also losing his top attorneys to COVID. As rocket scientist Rudy Giuliani, he's now hospitalized battling the virus since he thought masks were for, well, other folks. Jenna Ellis, she has also just tested positive as she stood shoulder to shoulder with him in many a case. Ellis attended a White House Christmas party on Friday, reportedly not feeling well and, yes, not wearing a mask while mingling with the other guests. You can always count on the dependable with these folks. Now, the president, he is trying to take matters into his own hands, God help us. He's called top officials in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, all personally, trying to get them to overturn the results in their states. That means, and many of you are watching us in these states, people who voted, he wants to overturn your vote here because he says so, and he wants to replace electors who will select Biden with those. Instead, he wants them to ignore the will of the people and choose Trump instead. Now, this is one of the things that people warned about, but nobody thought Trump would actually follow through on. He is. He's doing it, and the Trump lackeys in other states are also joining the ridiculous crusade. The Attorney General of Texas now, he is suing 4 battleground states that Biden won. By the way, none of them are Texas. He's claiming these other states illegally changed election laws. They didn't. And he wants the U.S. Supreme Court to block those states from voting in the Electoral College. His argument is that somehow it impacted Texas. I wouldn't hold his breath. The Arizona Republican Party is also at it again. Those are the same geniuses who posed with Rudy Giuliani right before he tested positive for COVID. Big smiles, no masks. In fact, the Arizona legislature now is having its doors closed after learning about Rudy because he spent 2 days with lawmakers there accomplishing nothing. But now the rocket scientists in the Arizona GOP, they had decided to post this clip on Twitter to show where exactly these patriots stand.
This is what we do, who we are. Live for nothing or die for something.
Again, if this all came under the heading, if they were willing to die for Donald Trump. It should be noted they've since deleted the Rambo tweet. Republicans in Washington aren't exactly a profile in courage either. The Washington Post, they surveyed every GOP member of Congress. I'm talking every Republican in the House and the Senate. And 27, that's the total number of them, would even acknowledge that Joe Biden is the winner. 220 of these cowards wouldn't even say who won, and 2 rocket scientists said Trump had beat Biden despite evidence to the contrary. But some Republicans are standing up to Trump and putting country before party. One of them, Georgia's Secretary of State, who is now getting death threats for his efforts.
I know there are people that are convinced the election was fraught with problems, but the evidence, the actual evidence, the facts tell us a different story.
Unfortunately, he one of the few, not the many, on the GOP side. I want to bring in our guest to discuss, Professor Paul Gronke. He teaches political science at Reed College. He's also considered one of the nation's foremost election experts. I'm curious how you look at where we are today, safe harbor, if you will. Do you think that the system held up, that we dodged a bullet, that while maybe the person who fairly won will be there, the damage will last far longer than we imagine? How do you look at where we are now in early December with the election in the not too distant rearview mirror?
Well, we're at the safe harbor deadline. The safe harbor deadline is established so that any litigation at the state level needs to be completed by this point so that the Electoral College can meet. So I think the system, the election administration system, Richard, I think that held up well. Officials throughout the country, more than 10,000 local election officials completed the election. We have the 50 states in the District of Columbia. We have certified results. So that part of the system, I think, held up very well. Where the system, we found a lot more cracks here, Richard, was the willingness of elected officials throughout the country, all of them Republicans at this point, to continue to question the results, to be unwilling to acknowledge that Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris won the 2020 presidential election.
You know, and I want to get to that, but the things that we feared were going to happen on Election Day and the run-up were real suppression and scary suppression. People with guns and voting at polling places. All of a sudden, you know, the idea that mail-in ballots were going to disappear and not count. Those things didn't happen, and there were a few heroes that stood up. And I'll get to the bigger picture about the people who won't acknowledge reality or even abet some of the worst instincts. But people stood up, and I was worried that there was enough courage, especially if you were a Republican and the president, the head of your party, was telling you to do otherwise. But enough people said, no, we're going to count them, we're going to count them fairly. And at the end of the day, whoever won, won, whoever lost, lost. And we've seen a lot of people either like Krebs may show the door consequently for this, or we've seen state secretaries of state Republicans that are now, you know, having to get security details because of the death threats that have come their way. But at the end of the day, they did the right thing. How good should we feel about that?
I think we should feel good. I think that the threats that Secretary Benson, for example, in Michigan has experienced, you know, we had a series of officials in Georgia stand up. I think one of the key moments, Richard, and I don't know how you felt about this, but this moment when Gabriel Sterling, the voting systems administrator in Georgia, not someone who would normally be a high-profile actor. Mr. Sterling stood up a number of days ago and simply said, this has to stop. It's gone too far. He was receiving death threats. I think you're right, Richard. I think people who are in the election administration community, secretaries of state, nationwide directors, I believe they have stepped up. I'm still quite disappointed that so many members of Congress, that so many Pennsylvania GOP legislators in the state of Pennsylvania are essentially calling for overturning their state's results. But I agree with you. The system held up well. Many officials stood up. Christopher Krebs is a hero here. So the system was secure. It was it was a fraud-free election. Let's move on.
Right, but then I do the half empty, which is if this thing was closer, Paul, what would have happened then? And at the end of the day, this is by popular vote tallies at least north of 6 million. That was the difference. The electoral count was the same margin that Trump won 4 years ago. And still, I mean, I saw an ad, we played it coming into this. You have the Republican Party, the state GOP in Arizona, asking people if they're willing to die to stand up for Donald Trump. And that's the state party. We did the numbers. The Washington Post asked just 25 out of 249 members of Congress that recognize themselves as Republicans are willing to at least acknowledge that the president elect was voted on fairly, and we can move on. To me, what I'm worried about is if this wasn't so ham-handed and this was closer, where would we be right now? Am I right to worry, or did we learn our lesson from a month ago?
I think you're right to worry. Look, I had some of those same numbers written down myself. So we have a list of profiles in courage in the Republican Party, but not many. And it is some of the usual suspects. It's Ben Sasse in Nebraska, who has spoken out against some of the things that the president has said. We have Mitt Romney, who for a long time has tried to sort of occupy what might be called, a Republican position, contrary to simply a party that is just a personalistic party of the president. But there just aren't many. There aren't enough. Look, there are 160 million votes cast, Richard. There are going to be some problems here and there. That's the state of the world. But there's nothing systematic. We even had Attorney General William Barr come out and say, look, haven't found any fraud. And now we're hearing calls for his resignation. I just don't understand where the Republican Party is right now, how they're going to navigate through this. So this is really problematic. We have 50 million Americans who believe this election was unfair. This is not like 2000. This is not one state, one county. This is really many, many states where they're calling into question the system.
And the problem is their base is listening. The polls, and you know this, Paul, more than 70% of Republicans right now believe that Trump was cheated out of the election. So this profile and cowardice is at least messaging in this obviously siloed media world we live in right now that somehow there was a steal that went on here. So to that end, what can we do to make sure we don't come back to the same situation 2 years from now in the midterms or 4 years for the next presidential? Because the amount of wasted time, and we'll see it consequentially here with this held up transition as we're dealing with COVID, and the ability to just do, meaningless and meritless challenges in the courts and creating all this false narrative. Is there a way that we can, after the votes are tabulated, that we can have a certification sooner without all this silliness and without the possibility of a new slate of electors being put up to, basically outstrip the will of the people? Is this the way it has to be, or can we do it better?
I think we can do it better, Richard, and I really do appreciate you asking that question. There are many efforts underway nationally and in states. So my work, as you know, is trying to work and partner with local election officials nationwide to help train them. We have, a number of individuals who, the few nights after elections, they stepped up, their staffs worked all night. You and I talked about a number of those. There's very likely going to be a commission to look back at this election. And I think a lot of this is trying to just continually communicate to the American people how the system works, have more audits in place, have more transparency, and use technology, really, Richard, technology to help people show how these systems work, that really it is very clear, very transparent, that we do welcome observers. Observers are not turned away from the polls, and just keep reminding people how our system works, and all the protections are in place, and just keep working to try to keep that message out.
And I don't know how you do it, but I would just ask that any of the electeds who ran and won their seats would show the same courtesies that they expected to anyone else of subsequent elections here, because it's not going to work here if everybody's feeding all this nonsense. And I'm just shocked, pleasantly so, that no one really got hurt in this process, because there were so many different turns here where the worst elements could have taken over. But thankfully, as I said at the beginning of this, I think we dodged the bullet. Paul, as always, great job, and thank you for the time.
Absolutely, Richard. Thank you.
And up next, we shift gears. We're going to be talking about the battle for the control of the Senate, and it's come down to one state and one state only, Georgia. We will have a live report from the battleground state, and also we'll be speaking with the former HUD Secretary, Julian Castro, about the all-important Hispanic vote.
Purdue and Loeffler have been catering to the very wealthy and serving themselves instead of serving the people of Georgia. Ossoff and Warnock are going to serve the people of Georgia instead of themselves.